What about the top of a brownie? What do you want the top of a brownie? Because I feel like that's also one of the defining
Hmm.
characteristics of a brownie versus a cake. Because a cake has a
Yes,
sort of spongy open top, right? Whereas a
absolutely.
brownie should have like a paper thin, like an eggshell thin, shiny, ideally shiny. Oftentimes it'll be kind of matte, but it'll have like a little crust on the top, like a little
A
sort of
little like
candyish crust.
glossy, sort of flaky top. I
Mm-hmm.
think it can be nice. Not all of my brownie recipes reliably deliver that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I found that the ones that did so more were more whipped, like if you were using an
Right.
electric mixer, but you also got a fluffier crumb that was slightly more cake like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't really want to go in that direction. Like I understood how to get it, but I didn't want it enough. I wanted the
Well,
center texture to be, it compromised for me what I wanted in the center texture. But that said, when I see that glossy top brownie, like I'm like, ooh, it looks like a brownie. I want it.
yeah. So I do remember, when I was at Cooks Illustrated, sometime in the mid 2000s, my roommate at the time, Yvonne Ruperti, who
Oh, wow. Love it.
she was working on a brownie recipe, and then also Stella Parks later at Serious Eats was working on a brownie recipe. That her recipe appears in her book Brave Tart. What Yvonne found at Cooks Illustrated was that, first of all, the type of sugar makes a big difference. So using white sugar is going to give you a much smoother top than if you use brown sugar. I think it's because
Mm-hmm.
brown sugar is more hygroscopic, which means that it
Mm-hmm.
pulls in moisture from the atmosphere, and so the top of the brownie doesn't dry out properly if you use something like brown sugar. So white sugar is real important. And then the other real important part, and this is the thing that Stella stresses a lot in her recipe, is making sure that the sugar is completely dissolved in the batter. So if you're making your batter, you want to add the sugar to the eggs and kind of beat them until the sugar is, until the eggs are kind of ribbony. The same way that if you're making a custard where the sugar is completely dissolved in there. And when you do that, the sugar kind of rises to the top and creates that sheen. As opposed to if the sugar is added directly to the dry ingredients, where you get more of sort of a matte top.
But I'm wondering if, like, with my favorite brownies, you melt the chocolate and the butter together, and then you add the sugar and you whisk it in. I'm
Hmm.
wondering if, because I'm not super into the texture you get from electric whipping eggs, like that aeration. I'm not that
Mm.
keen on it, but I am wondering now. Now I kind of want to play around and see if I like then maybe wait 5 minutes for the sugar to dissolve in the warm butter.
Hmm.
More so it's not grainy anymore. Like give it 5 or 10 minutes
Yeah,
and
or
then
even
continue the recipe. Could I get that more of a crackly top? Anyway, I'm gonna have to go play
yeah. What
around,
about what
obviously.
about doing? So there's a famous New York Times chocolate chip cookie recipe, and in my chocolate chip cookie recipe, actually also as well for Serious Eats, you make the dough and then you let it sit overnight.
Ooh.
So that, well, there's a few things that happen. There's like enzymes that go into the flour and cut it into smaller pieces so that you get a little bit more, like a deeper flavor, more browning. But also you get the sugar dissolves better and you get more hydrate. The flour hydrates better. So it improves the texture and the flavor. This is actually a trick that works for virtually any cookie dough, any chocolate chip cookie dough,
I
if you
should
let it
play around
rest
with this.
overnight. But I
Yeah, I
wonder
would
if you
like
did the
to.
same thing, make a brownie batter and let it rest overnight.
Ooh, I think
How
I
that
might
would
play around with
affect,
that.
yeah.
Because I don't really want to add steps and I don't want to add ingredients. And I agree with you on the brown sugar that I found that it didn't make it's a lot of the things that seem like they would make brownies better often doesn't. Like
Hmm.
for example, I am not that keen on brown sugar in them. I love brown sugar in so many baked goods, but I didn't feel like it added to brownies when I made them.
Hmm.
The other thing is I've played around with higher cocoa proportions
Hmm.
where you swap some of the flour for the equal weight in cocoa, and I'm thinking I'm going to get a fudgier brownie, and maybe you do, but I also feel like the brownie gets a little more matte and like
Mm.
a little more debt and not anyway. I wasn't getting what I wanted from these swaps, because the logical thing would be like, oh, let's just get rid of the flour and use cocoa powder or whatever, but
Right, right, right.
it wasn't. Or even just to swap half, I played with it, I ended up with these kind of matte dull surfaces, and I didn't like it as much.
So I know in your Deb's favorite brownie recipe, So I actually made two different brownie recipes. One of them was yours, the Deb's famous favorite brownies, and then the other one is also from your site. It was Alice Medrich's
Yes.
version,
Good.
which
I'm
is
glad you mentioned that because that's like reader's favorite.
and
I
that one
put
is so your recipe is made with actual chocolate that you melt with the butter. So let me talk through your recipe first. So you take chocolate and butter and you melt it in a double boiler in a bowl, and then to that you add sugar and vanilla, and then you beat in your eggs one at a time. And we can get back to that because I want to know why you have to beat the eggs in one at a time. And then you add some flour, and then you bake it all. Alice Medrich's recipe that you've adapted on your site is similar, but it uses cocoa powder as opposed to chocolate. Can you tell me what the difference is? What the two different things are going to do in your brownies? Cocoa powder versus chocolate. Because chocolate is basically what cocoa powder that also has some of the cocoa butter in it. Is that right? And it's just been properly sort of conched and tempered.
So Alice Measure, her brownie recipe is, I feel like, world or at least internet famous, cookbook famous. Her best cocoa brownies, and again, they're not my brownie. They're not the brownie I grew up with that tastes like the correct brownie to me. But they are beloved, and I would say Spit and Kitchen readers are pretty evenly divided on whether they prefer the best cocoa brownies or what I call my favorite brownies. But what I think she does something very, very interesting with it, where she, instead of using bar chocolate that has like the coconut cocoa butter in it, and the coconut oil in it. I'm not saying it right. With the fat,
cocoa butter, the cocoa fat.
Thank you.
Yeah, not coconut.
Exactly. So she says that by using cocoa powder and then using butter, you're basically just you're getting a better flavor. You get to use, basically she's replacing the fat that would be in the bar chocolate with butter. And like, who would not be happy about that? So it's a more butter heavy recipe. And again, it's kind of cool. You only have to use dry chocolate. I don't get a very glossy top when I make them, but I do see other people on the internet who have made them. They get a more glossy top. It's a very dense, again, deliciously buttery brownie, and there's no way you would be unhappy if you made these like immediately. I think I probably adapt them to be one bowl, and I probably do my own like fussy things with them, just to kind of keep it simple. But it's definitely a very dense. I wouldn't say it's very chewy. It's a very fudgy brownie more than chewy, and again, it's just super buttery. And you get a great chocolate flavor from just cocoa powder, especially if you're using like quote unquote good cocoa powder.
I think you get my guess is because cocoa powder is alkalized, whereas bar chocolate is not, and so with a bar chocolate you get sort of more of the acidic and fruity notes of chocolate as opposed to cocoa powder, which gives you sort of a deeper, like the base flavors of chocolate. So I think, I don't know, at least for my taste, I find that your brownies, the ones made with real chocolate, I use Ghirardelli for both of them, so I use the same product for both of them. But yours was made with Ghirardelli 100% bars, and Alice's I made with the Ghirardelli alkalized cocoa powder. I find that yours have a sort of more of the sort of fruitier, brighter flavors of
fruity. No,
of
that sounds
chocolate.
like my nightmare in a brownie. Well, that's right.
I guess I don't mean fruity, but like how chocolate can have like notes of cherry or notes of those brighter notes that people who write about chocolate talk about.
So you probably bake them like right next to each other within a day. How is
I
my
only had one
description
pan, so I did them one after the other. But yeah.
So how is my description of the texture differences accurate to what you found?
It is, yeah. And I also wonder how much of that has to do with sort of the ratio of ingredients versus the pH.
Okay.
But I don't know the answer to that.
No,
to
go
be honest.
off. I love it when you I'm like, please do the nerd thing. So I'm definitely not going to talk about the pH
it's just a question that I have because cocoa powder and bar chocolate have different pHs, like very different pHs.
Did you use a Dutch I'm forgetting what she asked for in the recipe. Does she ask for a Dutch cocoa powder? She says you can use natural or Dutch process. I generally prefer
I use
Dutch
an
process. So use basically all the European brands are Dutch process, and I find it to have like a nuttier, more rich chocolate flavor that I prefer. Yeah. I also feel that within brownie recipes themselves, it is far more common to have a brownie recipe that starts with bittersweet or baking chocolate, some sort of 72% thing. I personally,
Versus, you mean versus 100%?
versus 100%, which is what we call unsweetened chocolate. And that's kind of a uniquely American product. I don't really hear much about finding unsweetened chocolate in Europe. I've heard from European readers they're not finding it. Maybe they get 98% or 90, but it's not the same.
Right.
I haven't tested them side by side, but when I make brownies with a bittersweet chocolate, I'm not saying it's not a good brownie, and I'm not saying I'm not going to eat that brownie and enjoy it, but it never, for me, gets the chocolate intensity, the gravitas, the nuttiness, the depth of chocolate. I'm going on. I really feel strongly about this. I feel like I never get the chocolate richness that I want from bittersweet chocolate that I do from actually unsweetened chocolate. And that's part of the reason. And with my favorite brownies, you start with unsweetened chocolate. And for me, it's just, I feel like you get so much impact for so many fewer ounces of chocolate. I feel like if I'm using something like a bittersweet bar, I have to use a lot of ounces of it and it's still not as deep. And here I'm using, I'm trying to look at I know I've adjusted.
You use 3 ounces in your
3 ounces.
Yeah.
And I think in the olive oil brownie, which is really very similar, but like adapted for olive oil, I use 4 ounces. But again, it's a very small amount, and it's enough to make the whole pan fudgy. So there's there's
really
an impact
fudgy.
to it that I really like.
You know what's funny? You mentioned your olive oil. I did not make your olive oil brownies, but over Thanksgiving, we were at my sister's place in Colorado, and my mom had a box of brownie mix. And she made, like, we had all gone out for the day. She stayed behind. And when we got back home, like, she had made these brownies, and she said that she made a huge mistake and that she accidentally used extra virgin olive oil instead of regular oil in the brownie mix. But we all tasted them and they tasted real good. Like,
I like it.
Olive oil is a real good flavor in brownies. Yeah.
I think chocolate and olive oil go so well together. I've played around with it in cakes. I have a chocolate olive oil spread in my Keeper's cookbook. I really like what they're doing.
Olive oil on chocolate ice cream is really good.
It's so good. A little bit of salt, like it's different, but they go really well together. Again, it may not be like that classic brownie flavor, but it's not meant to replace your favorite brownies. But I think if dairy is an issue, or you're just looking for like a more nuanced flavor profile, I think they go really nicely together.
So this leads me to a question that I had for you. Some brownie recipes, so when you buy a box brownie, the mix almost always asks, you add egg and you add oil to it. Brownie recipes that you're making from scratch, some of them are going to use butter, some of them use oil, some use a mix. Can you talk to me about what oil versus butter is going to do in a brownie?
Yes and no. In general, I know that oil, I have not played around with box brownies nearly as much. I came from a ingredients household.
Yes.
We made things from
we know.
scratch. And now everyone has to suffer because of it. Everybody on the internet and everyone who listens to this podcast has to go find unsweetened chocolate because of the way I was raised. But in general, oil-based cakes are actually, they taste and often feel more moist to the touch. I think it has to do with the fact that like butter's kind of solid and oil is obviously butter can liquefy, but at room temperature and cold, it's solid. And oil, and also butter has added water in it, and oil does not, obviously.
Right.
So I find that when you make a cake with oil, it is generally softer and it feels more moist, and it actually feels more moist after a few days. So I would assume in brownies it does something similar, but you don't get the wonderful chocolate. You don't get the butter flavor. But I've definitely read that people like to, when they're trying to doctor up, make a boxed brownie mix taste better. Like maybe they replace the water with like milk or coffee, or they use melted butter instead of oil, or they might add extra salt or a teaspoon of good vanilla extract or like some espresso powder. Like there's so many ways you can play around with them. And I also feel like if you grew up with boxed brownie mixes, like that's the brownie, and we talk about this a lot, like your homing device, that's the brownie that tastes correct to you. And when I'm like, no, my favorite brownies are my favorite, it's because I didn't grow up with them. Like it's a different flavor profile.
We had Betty Crocker box mix brownies growing up.